Booker. Today we're going to finish up Solman. Kind of a shame. Enjoyed this book. So we're going to finish this up today. Maybe a slight intermission between the next couple of chapters, but let's get going. Lads had been lounging in the waiting room for an hour. Seated in a corner chair, he was close enough to intervene, but far enough he could keep the lounge and cashier's cage under constant observation. Everyone who came in was observed and analyzed. He had seen no threat and was beginning to wonder if the commissioner had got things wrong. Past time, he was discussing special tires with one of the salesmen for the treadnought. The old ones were beginning to wear thin, and he wanted some that would be still driven if punctured. The discussion became animated, and Flats was immersed in the memorizing sales pitch. Pedowski at the toy shop was wondering the same thing. The store was doing a brisk sale, and it would have been a sure bet any criminal would find it a temptation. Problem was that the amount of cash was limited. People mostly paid by check or credit card. He also had been in attendance for an hour and seen no reason for his being there. He contacted Flats on his shoe phone, and they agreed to wait a further hour. Nothing happened. They would meet up with Solman. As cover for staying there for hours on end, he began to take various puppets and brought them to life. Skilled in puppeteering, he was drawing a crowd of children who were enthralled as he brought stuffed animals to life. Marionettes danced, stuffed monkeys told awful jokes. A large stuffed dog acted as a real one and received hugs and plenty of attention. The store was grateful not only for the added security, but the spontaneous demonstration, which sold more toys than they had ever sold before. Harry was driving the treadnought at a snail's pace through a circuitous route. He doubted he was being fouled, but taking evasive action was part and parcel with the task at hand. He was sure that he would face the whole gang when he got to the factory. Parking at a distance, he wound his way to his objective. The darkness aided him to arrive unheralded. The factory was not large, but had multiple entrances. Using a can filled with a combination of tolnitholate and epidermorphin volcosum, which would show under ultraviolet light, he marked off the door he was prepared to enter. The door he chose had cigarette butts outside. Experienced Tyrannins told him, as well as simple logic, that these doors were usually made easily assailable. The door was locked with a bar locked from inside. Fortunately, the gap at the bottom of the door was without a wind guard. He slid a metal insert under the door bolt and lifted the latch. The door opened slightly, and taking a can of spray oil, he attached a long tube and sprayed the hinges. Allowing a small amount of time to elapse, the door opened silently. Opening the door further, he blocked any light from the outside with his body. Moving quietly, though swiftly, he found the stairs and began the arduous climb from the underside. Using small hooks covered in rubber attached to his wrists, he made the trek easier. In all these maneuvers, he remained unseen. Big Toe's men were vigilant, but Solman's actions had been virtually invisible. Arriving at the top where Big Toe's office was, he climbed onto the ledge closer to the wall. Shrouded in darkness, he bided his time. Seeing that the covering darkness ended, he would be exposed the moment he stepped 1 foot forward. He hoped his precautions had all been worth it. The lining pockets of his coat were filled with metal shoe inserts of sufficient strength and thickness to stop a bullet, but spaced enough to allow movement. The weight, though, had added to the fatigue Solman felt from the climb. Waiting for his arms to strengthen, he peered around, determining where the enemy was hiding. A gleam from a rifle barrel gave indication of one enemy high in the rafters, lying prone, their bodies shielded by the long girder. Another was on the ground floor behind large machinery. Using a mirror, he saw Big Toe behind the desk, dressed in a fastidious suit and hat, his lower face covered with a scarf. He was going over paperwork and seemed to be absorbed in his work. Seated beside him, seemingly half asleep, was one of his men, probably Harry, who was acting as his bodyguard. One person left to discover, and they were nowhere to be found, at least not from his present angle. Pulling a couple of cans of miniature spray from his pockets, he loaded them into a spring gun and lobbed the one up and the other down. One landed with unerring accuracy on the ledge. The adhesive attached it to the can, sticking when it landed, the other falling behind the machine. The impact set off the activator, causing the acrid spray to make the men retreat, coughing and retching. With two of his enemies disabled, it was time to make his move. Crawling in the narrow space below the window he rose on, Crawling in the narrow space below the window, he rose on the far side of the door. Nervous yet determined, he took a deep breath. Giving the door a tremendous kick, it rebounded off a rubber stopper midpoint up to the wall. Fortunately, he had leapt into the room without being struck. The door slammed shut behind him. Big Toe looked up casually. Generally, when a gentleman enters a room, he removes his hat. Solman slowly raised his hat, a bare minimum, and was replacing it on his head when a crashing blow struck from behind. In his anticipation of meeting his adversary, he had not checked behind himself. It was a critical error in an otherwise brilliant attack. He woke to find himself divested of coat and hat. Out of respect for his prowess, he had been allowed to retain his mask. A thorough inspection of his person had been accomplished, and he had been stripped of all his accessories. He was strapped down onto a metal table used to sew large shoes and bags. Raised above the table, he was on a leather sheet above a turntable. A folded sheet of leather lay across him. Big Toe admired the workmanship of the tool Solman had used. Very ingenious. I appreciate your use of shoe paraphernalia in keeping with the persona you created. I suppose your car is also embellished. It will make a worthy transport for my own uses. He pulled over a stool and sat on it to converse with Solman. You are destined to be sealed in leather, the softest leather here in stock. Once sealed, it will be shrunk to envelope your body completely. As for Flats and Pedowski, without you they will be helpless, and I shall take no action against them. He saw the faint smile of relief that crossed Solman's lips. I thought that would please you. I may be an evil genius, but I am not without some civility. I will leave you now in the capable hands of these two gentlemen. For myself, I'm going back to my office. The noise from this machine gives me a headache. Fear it will do as much for you. The two men watched as Big Toe ascended the steps. Once the door to his office closed, the letter was folded over Solman and the machine started. The hammer-like blows of needle-through leather beat a steady rhythm into his brain. It was deafening, and the vibrations from the table added to his confusion. Flats finished his conversation and looked at his watch. He had been talking with the salesman for over an hour. Panic-stricken, he climbed into his own vehicle and roared off to pick up Pedowski. He expected him to be outside and upset at not having been picked up sooner. Arriving late, he was surprised not to find Pedowski pacing up and down the sidewalk. Through the window, he spied the detective seated on a chair with a stuffed monkey on his lap. He was using his fingers and thumbs to manipulate head, arms, and legs. Apparently, what he was doing was amusing parents and the children who were laughing uproariously. The children seated around him were rocking and laughing, holding their sides. Let's hated to interrupt this show, but they hadn't heard from Solman, and he might be in urgent need of rescuing. Laying on the horn, Pedowski started, and handing over the monkey to one of the children, he fought his way through this grateful audience. Diving into the car, his door closed of its own accord as a speedy takeoff. Pedowski apologized, but Flats admitted his own lapse in timing. I just pray we're in time if anything has happened. Arriving at the shoe factory, Flats brought out a black light. Aiming it at the ground, he searched around. Pedowski was confused by his using a black light and pulled out a flashlight from his hip pocket. Flats waved it aside, and having finished with the ground, moved to the front wall of the window and door. I know he's left a trail for us. Where the... Oh. He paused as a narrow glowing, pointing at the right corner. Following it around the corner of the building, they found the door locked. Another arrow indicated that this was the door Solman had used. Flash tried to wedge a silver sliver of metal under the door frame, only to find it blocked. Tried inserting it into the frame near the doorknob. This too was blocked. He grunted in frustration and was about to find another entrance. Moving Flats aside, Pedowski pulled a thin, strong metal from his belt. Weaving it inside, he found an area of pressure. Bending the metal, it curved down. With more bending, the tip re-emerged. Grasping both ends and pulling the latch, the door partially opened. A chain across the plunger limited the opening. From the trunk of his car, Flats pulled a bolt cutter. It took the united strength of both of them to cut the chain. Once cut, it rattled to the floor. The two men waited to see if anyone was aroused by the chains falling. From where they stood at the partially opened door, they could hear the steady pulse of the stitcher and the whir of thread. It was highly unlikely anyone had heard them. All right, break time, real quick. Take care of what you need to do, and then we'll come back and finish up the rest of the book. Okay, I hope you had a good break. We'll continue on now, and let's get this finished. Within the restricting leather, Solman could feel exactly where the machine was sewing. He could tell by the tightness that it was nearing shoulder height. Hammer blows of the needle punching through leather was so loud he was unable to hear if the two men were still watching. Solman's head ached from the constant noise and increasing pressure. Stripped of his armaments, he was almost helpless. They had left it on his boots, though, and this would hopefully give him an edge. Within the heel of both shoes was a powerful spring that fed into the metal toe cap. Bent at an angle, the point thrust forward might be able to penetrate the soft leather. He pressed his heels together and felt pressure as the bolt shot forward and the tip extended. He couldn't tell if it had gone through. Sure that it hadn't shot clear, he hoped for at least a little penetration. Moving his feet side to side, he tried to cut away some of the leather. He had to turn his head to the side to breathe as the needle perforated the leather, approaching his head. Continuing to move his toes, he felt a small amount of give near his feet. Since nothing was being done to inhibit his progress, he surmised the two men are not in attendance. With a small hole growing in his feet, he struggled to loosen his bonds. When they had begun tying his feet and working upwards, he had been unconscious. By the time they were tying his wrists, he was awake and realized what was happening. Adjusting his muscles, he built as much slack as was possible. In the confines of the leather shroud, it wasn't much use. He had still been groggy when they had started sewing, and it was a quarter accomplished by the time he was fully aroused. Struggling to free his hands, he was at a standstill. However, a hole finally was cut through the leather at his feet, and the toes of his shoes were exposed. Flats and Pedowski were silently creeping in, making for the source of the hammering. From a distance, as they turned around the corner, they saw two large sheets of leather being sewn together with a bulge in the center. From the lavatory, they saw two of the Big Toe's thugs emerging, drying their hands in their shirts. As they approached the sewing machine from the opposite side of the floor, they saw a splotch of black near the foot of the leather. Harry squinted to determine what it was. Jake figured it was just a splotch of oil from the machine. Within the leather, Solman was using the last of his strength to raise his legs. In this, he was aided by the pressure from being sewn above his shoulder. The table turned as it approached the top right corner. Solman knew that if it passed his head, he was trapped for good. Momentarily resting, he called on the last reserves of his strength and gave a great heave, lifting his legs and tearing the leather. Continuing his momentum, he flung his legs backwards and over his head. The leather continued to tear, the weight of his legs pulling Solman through the confines of his leather coffin and over the edge of the table. He lay on the stone-cold floor, struggling and gasping. Jake and Harry dashed to the table with guns drawn. They knew they had stripped Solman of his accessories, but were not going to underestimate his ingenuity. Solman had rolled to a darkened area and continued to work on his bonds. With fresh air and the exultation of his freedom from almost certain death, renewed energy surged through his body. Twisting his wrists, the other bonds tore and fell apart. Flats and Pedowski saw Solman's escape and rushed to aid him. Flats pointed towards the darkened area where he felt Soleman had rolled to. The two thugs raised their weapons to fire. Flats raised both arms and, using his wrist projectile shooter, fired two hard heels at the wrists of the men. With yelps of pain, they dropped their weapons and reached for their reserves. Pedowski was looking everywhere for Soleman, sure that he must be in distress, possibly unconscious after his ordeal. The exertion of ripping through the tight shroud must have been exhausting, but try as he might, he could not find Soleman. Unwilling to use a flashlight, which would reveal Soleman not only to himself but to the gunmen, he continued to search blindly. The two men were moving as they drew their weapons, making it difficult for Flats to disarm them with his wrist gun. He fired the rubber heels continually until he ran out of ammunition. Moving as he fired, he was also a difficult target for the two men as he dodged, weaved, ducked, and leapt over objects. Thinking this was a call for emergency measures, he pulled his gun. Blood burst to the taking of life, and vowing to shoot only to wound and disarm, he hardened his heart. If these two perished in the engagement, then so be it. It was his life, or his and his friends'. From behind the safety of a cutter and covered from the rear by high cabinets, he fired as the men moved in to trap him. Winged in their gun hands by multiple arm wounds and more to the shoulder, they changed hands and continued to fire. They stopped when Flats ceased firing. Concerned that he was holding his last few bullets for when they were cleared of obstructions, they continued their next move, or considered their next move. Flats ceased firing only when he saw a dark bulk loom behind the two men. Certain it was his companion, he kept his aim but held his fire. The two were losing blood from the wounds and would soon tumble unconscious on the floor. They leaned back as though resting against something. That something was a wide hand truck that had been placed behind them. Swiftly strapped upright, they formed a barrier for the person behind. The cart moved slowly forward. A hand emerged between the bodies, firing at Flats, who returned fire, but his bullets only found the bodies of Harry and Jake. Their bodies jerked as the force of the bullets convulsed their flesh. Slowly, the person behind advanced with the henchman serving as a shield. In his determination to down Flats, and the hidden adversary had forgotten about Pedowski. Seeing Flats confined to a space that would soon be open to almost point-blank range, he leapt onto a table and hurled himself at the laden hand truck. It had been precariously balanced in one hand as the individual fired. With the added weight from the impetus of Pedowski's leap, the cart fell backwards, pinioning the man behind the bulwark. Flats emerged and showed his flashlight, expecting to finally meet Big Toe face to face. Pedowski pulled the struggling man out as Flats kept gun and light on the person. As he was raised clear, a shot rang out from above. Tommy crumpled to the floor, writhing in pain, soon to join his pals in death. On the ledge outside his office, Big Toe aimed for the two lawmen by using their flashlights as a guide. Flats, suddenly realizing he was making himself a target, flung the light away as he spun to cover. The shot was fired as he spun, leaving a divot on the floor where he had stood. Both men sought safety and returned fire. The bullets bounced off the beam Big Toe was standing behind. Chuckling into security, he figured it was only a matter of time before he was free to continue his foothold on crime. Taking over the city then would be simple, and he would be free to grow. With his hired gang dead, there was no chance they could betray him. Now there was no one to except Flats and Pedowski standing in his way. Solman must surely have expired, since he had seen him carried away in one last effort. He had watched Solman tumble off the table and lay in a heap on the floor. Momentum alone had carried him to a darkened corner, but since he never emerged, it was a safe bet Solman was no longer a concern. A grunt from behind him made Big Toe spin on his heel to come face to face with a man he had considered dead. Solman had spent the time during the melee creeping to the open staircase and climbing up the underside. Arriving at the top, he was exhausted but ready for the final battle. Only one of these two champions would walk away, but Would it be the champion of justice or evil? As Big Toe wheeled around, his fist shot out as he recognized his adversary. Soleman had expected this and had dropped and rolled forward, leaping to his feet. Big Toe was ready for when he rose and attempted to fire, only to be met with a click on an empty chamber. With a growl of anger, he threw the gun at Solman's head. Solman approached slowly, bobbing and weaving in case Big Toe had another weapon at the ready. He didn't, but reached behind to see if he could slow Solman down by making him think he did. The conference that the commissioner had sent them to had been beneficial. One of the situations covered was being enacted here and now. Someone had paid attention and worked his way in a ballet of footwork, confusing Big Toe as to how and when the attack would come. Becoming frustrated, Big Toe lashed out, only to strike air while Solman rained blow after blow, changing height and position. He fought with the fury of 10 men. Flats and Pedowski raced up the stairway, having found a phone and called in reinforcements. The chief had been in his office, waiting for the call, and led the attack. Storming the door they had indicated, they had barreled in and followed the sound of a fierce battle. On the ledge of his office, Big Toe was attempting to use his size and weight to force Solman back. Solman was using strategy to strike a blow, then fade away. Leaning one way, he attempted to strike, but moved in another direction away, leaving nothing but air to receive the blow. Big Toe realized eventually how he was being toyed with, and determining Solman's feint, he landed a sledgehammer blow that sent Solman reeling. One of the policemen raised his weapon to fire. It was struck aside by the chief, who didn't want Solman, Flats, or Pedowski struck. The gun fired, even as it was moving off Big Toe, was a target. The bullet glanced off the beam and struck Big Toe across the cheek. Feeling the searing metal of the bullet, Big Toe whirled around to trip over Solman's foot as he swept to the side. With a terrified scream, Big Toe fell forcefully across the guardrail, the momentum pivoting him over the edge. He plummeted down, striking the ground with a sickening thud. A dark stain seeped out and surrounded his body. The scarf that Big Toe always wore across the lower portion of his face was dangling on the rail. In the beam of the flashlight, the commissioner's face was revealed. The police chief, Soleman, the Flats, and Detective Pedowski were having a cup of coffee in the chief's office, discussing the end of Big Toe and his crime wave. Short as it had been, it was a daring attempt at crime by a man who had always fought on the side of right. I don't understand what made him turn criminal. I know he felt he wasn't appreciated enough, and maybe it finally got to him. An ambulance driver staggered in, pale as a ghost, and weakly fell into a chair. A cup of strong coffee was placed in his hand. He looked at those assembled and struggled to get any words out. He seemed frightened and baffled at the same time. Chief Woodward, I don't know how to explain what's happened. It's beyond belief. Chief patted the man on the shoulder, pulled up a chair, and sat beside him. Solman, Flats, and Pedowski turned their chairs and looked encouragingly. The driver drained the cup in one go. Looking around him, he saw only interested faces. Taking another cup of coffee, he told his tale. Like I said, I can't explain what happened, and I don't think anyone would believe what it did. The funeral home couldn't pick those crooks up, so we were called in. We picked up the 4 men, and 3 went in the other ambulance, and the one you called Big Toe was in mine. The attendant with me was Scott Morgan, and a more reliable man I don't know. Since we were carrying a deceased, we had him strapped down on the stretcher. He was placed on the gurney and strapped down there as well. Scott sat with me since there was nothing we could do for them. We were about a half a mile from the coroner's office when there was a bright light from the back. Scott leapt out of his seat and grabbed an extinguisher. We thought maybe the body had an incendiary on it that we missed. Pulling over to the side of the road, and I went to help. Guys, the gurney and the stretcher both had the straps still on and were still locked down. The remains, though, were gone. All that was left was a pair of abominably smelling black boots lying on the table, toes up. I don't mind admitting we were a bit shaken up. In all the years we've been doing this, we've never seen a body just up and disappear. We were going to the front when we thought maybe we ought to put the boots into a container. When we approached the gurney, I'll be damned if the boots hadn't disappeared too. The back door was still locked from the inside, so I swear nobody could have gotten in and taken them. Scott shook up, so they put him on admin leave, and I might have to go too. Jar got up, tossed his cup in the trash, and left. He looked like a broken man who had seen too much. Soleman drained the last of his coffee and stood. Flats did as well. They shook hands with the chief and Detective Pedowski and left solemnly. Chief, you know how to get a hold of us when you want us, but please give us a couple of days. The chief watched the men depart and with concern in his eyes. Pedowski was also concerned. He hoped things hadn't gotten too much for Soleman and Flats. He was determined to see them, but as had been requested, he would wait. Perry, Oedipus, Persephone, and Charon were out for an evening. Charon and Persephone were concerned by how quiet Perry and Oedipus had been. They understood a little about their latest exploit, that several people had lost their lives. True, they were criminals, but they still were people. Charon turned to Oedipus. Is this the end of Soleman and Flats? Oedipus shook his head and no, then shrugged. He could only speak for himself. Well, Flats remains. I was a policeman and trained to face these possibilities. He turned to Solman. You haven't had the same training. You're incredibly smart. You have enormous perseverance, and you care enough to put yourself in harm's way to protect others. You always want to do what's right. Problem is, for you, this started out as a game. It was a challenge to pit your wits against an adversary, and you are damn good at it. You'll get even better over time, but in the end, you need to decide, and decide knowing this could happen again. I'm with you 100%. I joined the force and then you because I want to see good prevail. Are you still willing to see it through? Harry smiled. Oedipus was more than just his partner, he was his friend. Pedowski, too. Pedowski and Oedipus knew the risks to others as well as to themselves and had entered the force with eyes open. Well, Perry's eyes had been forced open and to look at a worst-case scenario live and in color. Could he continue? He looked at the three people looking anxiously at him. Persephone held his hand. I'll still love you, mask or no mask. Perry sat up straighter, his face set in lines of determination. I knew deep in my heart this was a possibility. That's why I was against us carrying guns. However, had we not had them, it is possible, maybe even probable, that Oedipus and Pedowski could have lost their lives. You don't stop doing something like this because you have to make difficult decisions. You do it because the times when you have to make those decisions and make the decisions matter for yourself and others. Beneath the sable, his shoes glowed faintly at first, then brighter as Perry's determination strengthened. He pulled out the mask Persephone had given him and put it on. Whenever there is cause, Soleman and Flats will put their best foot forward and stop our crime. Look for the next thrilling adventures of Soleman and Flats. The healed Avengers will return. So that's it. We are now done with that one. The next one will be this one. How do we get it? There we go. We're doing that Sheriff in a Small Town 2 next. So I look forward to doing that one. The first chapter is going to be live. So I will put out a notice within the next week or two of the exact date and time. I hope you will join me as we change over and go from, just doing a reading, but this time we'll do it live and with all the hazards that are possible with doing it live. So we might get a few bloopers in this one. So I look forward to seeing you. I hope you'll be here. Join me. Be good and be good to yourself.